Hey students, welcome to your first virtual lab for Psych 317. As you can see, this is your new classroom that you'll be coming in. So today what we're going to be focusing on is open data in the social sciences. Now, hopefully you read your chapter from Chambers again, from Seven Deadly Sins of Psychology. And what he talks about in this chapter is the problems with data hoarding. Now, data hoarding has a lot of implications. It can hide misconduct. It's secretive to hide all of your data. And additionally, one way to avoid all of this is through open data practices that we can implement into social psychology research or research in general. It doesn't just have to be social psychology. So you might be asking yourself now, what is open data? Now, open data, as it says clearly here on the slide, is the idea that some data should be freely available to everyone to use and republish as they wish without restrictions from copyright or patents or other mechanisms of control. So this goal of the open data movement are similar to those of the other open data movement or open movements in the open web, in which we're trying to get away from paywalls and everything's just so that we can make things free on the internet. So paradoxically, this is actually paired with a rise in intellectual property rights. And what I mean by that is, in these intellectual property rights are those that are given to the researcher who collected the data. The researchers themselves feel that they have the right to their own data and they don't have to share the data to others. So it's this balance that we have to find between allowing the researcher to have their intellectual property rights as well as keeping this open source movement available. But essentially, the philosophy behind open data has long been established, but the term open data itself is gaining popularity with the rise of the internet, and especially with the launch of open data government initiatives such as data.gov. And essentially what these are is now our government, the American government, other governments across the world at times as well, are posting public data sets for researchers to utilize at their own free will, which is quite amazing actually. Um, and what it allows us to do is to do research on large data sets, massive population-based data sets. Some of these data sets are from the census, these can be from healthcare initiatives, these are other resources as well. So now we're going to break down what this open source, open data movement is specifically, right? So we can break this down into three separate domains of what defines open data. Now, the first one that we're going to focus on is availability and access. And what this means is that data must be available as a whole and at no more than reasonable reproduction costs to get. And additionally, it should be preferably downloaded over the internet. Given that it's 21st century, we're doing virtual lectures now, I think it's pretty safe to say that we should be having an expectation that things can be downloaded over the internet for this open data movement. Now, it's also important from this availability and access, as going into the availability portion of it, that the data must also be available in a convenient and modifiable form. What that means is a convenient form that is available to everyone. So something like a CSV file or an Excel document is totally a convenient form and modifiable form for us right now that is available. So when you're thinking availability and access, exactly what the terms mean. It needs to be available and it needs to be accessible, right? So those are the two terms that you need to associate with. Now the next one is reuse and redistribution. So what this means is that the data must be provided under terms that permit reuse and redistribution, including the intermixing with other data sets. Now, the intermixing of other data sets is that it should be as closely identifiable with other data sets as possible. This means that we need to be able to allow users to have the ability to combine data sets, to look at across data sets, to do research that is available for across these other data.gov and other public data set uses. Now, it's also, for the last one, is that this needs requirement of universal participation. And to sum that up a little bit more easily is essentially we can't discriminate, right? There can't be discrimination about who can use these data sets in order to do research and find out more information about some sort of research question at hand, if they form a hypothesis, and so forth, right? And really where this might come into more play is that a data set built for education specifically shouldn't be distributed to only educational researchers. It should be available to all researchers because we need to keep in mind that this is an open data resource. So when you are thinking about open data, I want you to think about these three terms specifically, right? We have availability and access, reuse and redistribution, in which people are able to reuse the data sets as many times as they can, and they're allowed to redistribute it. It's allowed intermixing of data sets as well, and the universal participation, which essentially means that we cannot discriminate based on a field or any sort of group on this. Now, I'd like to get back to what we were talking about when we were talking about this intermixing of data sets, and I want to kind of clarify a little bit more about what that means. Now, what that means is essentially we want to have operational definitions of what our variables are within data sets. And what this is called specifically is interoperability. Now, I know I'm usually pretty bad with words, but I feel like I nailed that one. So interoperability means that the diverse systems and organizations are able to work together. So in other words, interoperate is what we're talking about. Interoperate with each other. So in this case, it's the ability to interoperate or intermix different data sets overall. Now, this can be done several ways. This can be done through some really great data dictionary, through clearly defining what your variables are, and so forth. Now, this is an important concept because it allows for different components to work together. The ability to componentize and to plug together components is an essential building block to this complex system of all these data sets that we have in general. Now, if the open data movement works correctly, we should have a large sum of data sets that really becomes manageable with interoperability. If we have defining characteristics of how to define certain variables, of how to create a good data dictionary and so forth, then we are able to actually have these data sets able to combine and able to make more inferences, more population-based inferences, looking at different populations and comparing them with one another. Really, the possibilities become somewhat endless when we have a good and well-defined data set for our users to identify with and to compare with other data sets as well. Now, without this idea of interoperability, it becomes nearly impossible to do this. Now, just to give you a little example about the real world implications of this, I at one point actually had a job where the entire point of our organization was to standardize data sets across different healthcare systems. This is actually a huge place where we're looking into. Part of the Obamacare and Obama administration was to standardize data sets as well. There's actually a point in Obamacare as well. So to talk about this is not only is this like really great for us, but this is actually potential job opportunities as well, is standardizing data sets and making them interoperable with each other. And when I was working at that data set, we were making it so that data sets across different healthcare industries were able to have this interoperability with them so that we can go from one healthcare system to multiple healthcare systems in order to make inferences about an entire population in the United States. So it's a pretty big deal actually right now. So we kind of face this situation in regards to data and trying to find these core of common data elements, right, or code and so forth, in which we have this open material right now. So we have a lot of data sets that are available publicly, but we're not really able to intermix them. So that's what the entire point of this is to do, is to make it so we can intermix these data sets. And as you can see from this kind of image that we're looking at here, it's showing, okay, if we can get access from one data set, we can pull it from there and so forth. I think this is extremely, extremely useful in the healthcare industry. in general, as well as social psychology framework. But it really goes well beyond that of the social psychology framework. And what I'm going to tell you is that this is a really important concept that we need to focus on when you're thinking of building a data set. And when you're initially building a data set, think about, okay, how is this going to be public, and how can I make it so that it's easy to people to do? And that's through this idea of interoperability, right? Now that can be done through creating a really nice data dictionary, or trying to find standardized practices within your field of how to define common variables and so forth. And with open data comes another concern that we've talked about multiple times in this class already, actually, which is privacy concerns, right? So because data is open, we always need to adhere to what's called HIPAA standards oftentimes, which is oftentimes associated with privacy and who can be identified and what is identifiable information. Oftentimes in the industry, when you're working in open data, some things that are very open and identifiable are names, of course. Then there's also birth dates, which are sometimes considered identifiable information as well. So it can go beyond that of just a name or something like that. Of course, you have social security numbers, which are identifiable, and all sorts of other things. So it's really important to be cognizant about what it is that's being posted in these open data avenues, right? And it's important to really think about, because you can get yourself in a lot of trouble from organizations coming in, IRB, HIPAA kind of things as well, coming in and really knocking you down because of privacy concerns, and we additionally don't want to be giving out any identifiable information. I think it's kind of part of the social psychology creed to not give out identifiable information. So we need to always be concerned when we're doing this open data, as great as it is, to also be focused on the privacy of our clients or participants as well. And just to bring up another thing is that with that past organization I worked for, where our entire thing was standardizing data sets, this was actually a subcomponent of our jobs as well. So this, again, I want to always point out the potential job opportunities that are associated with open data movements, standardization of data, and data privacy as well. Our entire focus too was in these enormous data sets that we were building that were meant to be commonly and openly distributed to other healthcare the entire healthcare industry. Privacy was probably our number one concern, in which we had to always remove identifiable information and so forth, right? So when you're thinking about these public data sets, always make sure you are clear on what the privacy restrictions are, what is identifiable information, and so forth with that. I guess now what I want to explain is, why is open data useful? I mean, we wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't useful to some degree, right? I mean, it obviously has implications. We've even brought up a few examples previously about why it's so useful. Now, so there are many areas where we can expect open data to be of great value, and where examples of how it's already existed and how we've seen it being used before. And there's also a lot of groups of people and organizations who can benefit from the availability of open data, as opposed to this closed data hoarding techniques that were mentioned in your Chambers book, right? That just seem to inspire secrecy and seem to be a cause or a reason to believe in like data manipulation of some sort, right? But many groups can benefit from these, including government itself and the citizens of a country's government or state government or some sort of local government, right? It can be on any level of government that we can really focus on, even kind of in a worldwide status. It benefits the government and the citizens from that government. However, we need to be understanding, and we can't really predict very precisely how and where and how much value any open data sets that we create will be in the future. So, and that's just sort of the nature of innovation, right? The innovation of development and of these open data site practices, these may come from unlikely places. So it's not really to say that all data that's open is useful, right? But it's enough to say that we've had open data in the past that has been useful already, and we can already see the benefits that we've achieved from that. So we could already have some examples of open government data, and specifically that is useful for everyday citizens to gain an understanding of their country, of their state, of their government itself, right? Or the government uses it itself. So in terms of transparency, which is kind of the underlying concept of this open data movement, there's been countries have had several projects out there in which they've tried to inspire this open data movement. You know, U.S. government is pretty good with some of their data, with the census, and the CDC provides some data, a lot of other data sources out there that are huge. Now, a few countries in general that I want to kind of point out is, for example, in Finland, there's something called the Finnish tax tree, which is an open data set in which they allow you to see where all of your tax money is being spent, which is an extremely useful product for the consumers, who the consumers would be the citizens of the nation, to see where your tax money is being spent. Additionally, the British government as well has this program called Where Does My Money Go?, in which they allow you to, again, see where your tax money is going. Now, one of the most interesting aspects here that happened was in Canada's government, where they had an open data movement, or an open source data that they had, in which it actually ended up saving them $3.2 billion, because citizens and researchers and other individuals researched this their taxes and see where they're going, and they actually saved the government $3.2 billion in charity tax fraud. So this is the government giving money to charity organizations that were fraudulent. And because of open data, they're able to save the government $3.2 billion and allow that money to be freed up to be used in other places as well. Additionally, another example in which we can kind of see where open data has been used at a population level, and I want to keep that in mind, that these are population level statistics that we're dealing with. Government data oftentimes is population level. We are able to make inferences about an entire population of people because they're so enormous, because it's actually of as many citizens as we could possibly get using great sampling strategies as well. Now, one example, just to kind of end off this slide, another example is the Danish have a website called Folketing.dk. I probably butchered that as usual, in which they track activity in the parliament and law tracking and law making process in as real time as possible, so that the citizens and parliamentarians involved are able to keep track of what laws are being made, what laws are being proposed, and so forth with that. I want to bring up another example just to really drive home the kind of value of open data and what it's done and how it can actually not only give us more information, but cause a more efficient work environment, cause efficiency within a government, cause efficiency within a organization, and so forth, right? So, for example, the Ministry of Education, Culture, and Science of the Netherlands was one organization that actually really benefited from this open data movement, in which case they posted all of their data online and available easier for civil servants to access, for individuals to analyze, and so forth. And they actually stopped receiving as many questions, as many the number of questions dropped. They reduced the workload of the employees of the Ministry of Education in the Netherlands. and therefore they were able to actually reduce the size of the department overall and save money for the actual country in general. This actually proposed them to start working with other organizations as well and collaborate with other kind of historical societies and other groups such as the Wikimedia Foundation, to execute their own tasks more effectively so that they can create a more primary data set that's easy to access. And additionally, it's easy to analyze and easier to make inferences as well. So it not only did having this open access make a organization or a ministry work more efficiently, but it also made it so that that the department had better data and were able to make better inferences about their data overall. The quality of the data increased exponentially because they had the access to these other organizations who helped them to create a better data set for them. Now I want to talk to you about actually giving you rules to actually opening up a data set that you may own now or potentially own in the future, right? So there's actually a really great way to do this because it's actually not an easy process, but we're giving you 3 rules that will hopefully make it easier to do. Now, your first rule is actually one of my favorite rules, is actually keep it simple. I like when things are simple, and that's how things should be most of the time. So when you're opening a data set, start with a small data set, right? It's something that's simple and fast, something to do, because you have to keep in mind, as of now, there's no requirement that all data sets be made open right now, right? Start out by opening up one data set or even one part of a large data set. It doesn't have to be the entire data set, especially if you have concerns about privacy issues, as we mentioned earlier, right? So it could even be part of a large data set that you want to kind of reduce down to make public for people. But I will say, the more you can open up, the better. Is kind of the trend that we're going on with right now. Remember that this is all about innovation, right? Moving as rapidly as possible to open up data sets is kind of our goal right now. And when we kind of open up these data sets kind of rapidly, we can learn from mistakes, we can learn from our failures, from our successes, and so forth. Really, every data set in some way, shape, or form is going to be useful to researchers, whether it be a small amount or a large amount, right? The important thing is that we keep these data sets open, right? Now, that's really the first rule, is keeping it simple. Start off with just a simple data set that you have worked on before, and how we post those is going to be a little bit later in the slides. Now, the next thing is, once you have your data sets open, it's always important to engage early and often. Now, what that means is that when you post a data set, oftentimes people are interested. They want to utilize data sets. They want to utilize your work towards them, whether that can be a research professional, that can be a citizen of some sort, a business partner, a developer of some sort. It really depends on the context of the data and how it wants to be used, right? So the government is one portion that we often see where they are posting lots of data sets already for us. And oftentimes this is a requirement that they need, because they have these data sets, people to be engaging with other researchers about these data sets. You can always contact individuals about these data sets. It's not just a blank page that you're looking at with no help. There's actually contact information from every government public data set that I've ever seen, actually, where you can have some sort of contact with someone. Now, granted, they should be questions that are useful, that couldn't have been answered in some other way, shape, or form, but there's always a way there. Now, you, as someone who posted a open data set, for individuals, you need to also be engaging in this. So once you take this open access, this open data set approach, is your responsibility to also be engaging with users as well. Now, the individuals that will be contacting you are oftentimes called infomediaries. Now, these are people that will often take your data to present it in another way, shape, or form to another audience. Now, these are the important individuals. So I want you to remember that term. infomediary. These are the individuals that will take your data set, they will transform your data set, or in some way transform that so that they will be useful to an audience. These are the individuals that you will be in contact with most when opening up a data set. Now, like for an example of who an infomediary may be is an individual who is interested in, let's say you post a data set full of data coordinates of some sort that can be mapped onto an actual like United States map of, let's say, health risk by state or something like that. An infomediary is the individual that will go and actually take your data and convert it from those geo coordinates and actually put it onto a map to display to an audience in order to repurpose your material. So that's really who you're going to be dealing with this oftentimes. And this is actually good because what they'll do is they can often find things like mistakes in your data or something like that, which isn't bad. We're all human. These are errors that we make. Having a mistake in your data set is not horrible thing to have. It can be simply fixed, and then you have to address and engage anyone who's been a user of your data set of mistakes that have been found through human error. Of course, this is not the same as data manipulation or anything like that. A mistake is a mistake. Human error is something that is just common in data practice techniques, and we all need to be realistic about it. Additionally, for our last rule, what we need to do is address common fears and misunderstandings. So this is really important for you. This is especially important if you work with a large institution or a government organization in which you need to, I want you to identify the most common fears that people will have about your data and then address them as early in the stage as possible. Now, what this means is when you are posting your open data to some sort of website or some sort of resource that I will give to you a little bit later, that you have some sort of descriptive text addressing any misunderstandings that commonly come up with the data or any common fears that can happen. So we've just talked about the 3 rules of opening data. Now I want to give you 4 steps to opening data. Now, I know that these are considered steps and there's 4 of them, but I want you to keep in mind that these might be intermixed, interchanged a little bit. We kind of tried to organize this in the way that we felt was best suited and seemed to make the most sense. However, when I'm talking about these, remember some of these might be done concurrently, or additionally you might get to like step 3 and realize I need to take a step back actually and go back to step 1. But we'll talk about them in this way and with the understanding that you can go back and forth between steps and they can be done at the same time. So let's start with our first step. It's choosing your data set. So keep in mind that when you are choosing a data set, you may need to return back to this step at a later stage, okay? So choosing your data set is kind of what we did discuss in the last slide, is you want to make sure that this is a data set that you can open up and that is easy to open up as well, and that is manageable to you as the researcher. The next thing you're going to do is to apply an open license, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but really what this often means is that you are uploading it to some sort of site that will give it to you, an open license to you as well. However, I want you to note when you are applying for an open license, you need to keep aware of what intellectual property rights you have. Now, you as a researcher, you may have collected the data yourself, then that's all the intellectual property is given to you. However, if this is a team of researchers, well, it's a little bit more of a gray area. Who owns this data? Who is intellectually driven with this data, right? So you need to actually make sure that when you are posting open data, it is not only okay with you as a researcher, but the other team that you work with as well. So those are what we mean when you are determining the intellectual property, and this will determine if you are going to be able to have an open license as well, and it needs to support everyone that was involved as well. We talked a little bit about this in the kind of what is open data as well. Now, if you've kind of determined that you don't have all the intellectual rights to this data and someone in your team disagrees, well, maybe it might be time to do some heavy convincing or just lay it off and say, well, I guess we have to go back to choosing another data set, right? Now, applying an open license and making the data available, I find are oftentimes done at the same time and concurrently. This is really where you are publishing it to some sort of open data website. These are like openscience.org or something like that, in which someone can utilize your data set. Oftentimes when you do that, it'll oftentimes apply an open license for you because you are the first person to have made this data set and you have the rights to this data set and it is your intellectual property while being open to the public at the same time. Now, you need to try and make it so that's available in a useful format. Again, these are things like CSV files or so forth. It's something online and is distributable. Now, keep in mind, when we talk about things where making sure that it is available in a useful format, what I oftentimes mean is I don't want it to be behind a paywall of some sort. When you're creating a data set, this has to be in a format that people don't have to pay for, which is a big part of the open data science movement, open data, open science in general, where we want things to become free. That's what all of open source really is making things free for people to, work with. And then the next thing is to make it discoverable. Post it on the web. Oftentimes, this is again with steps 2 and 3. When you post it to these websites of some sort, it is automatically being made discoverable. And what we'll talk about is later is how these actually become discoverable in ways that you can find these public data sets online in a format that is hopefully easy to use and to download and to work with. So let's talk about the first step that we talked about, which was choosing the data set. So choosing the data set is oftentimes your first step. Though remember, I want you to keep in mind that the whole process of opening up data is iterative. So you can return to this step and if you encounter problems later on. And additionally, there's no requirement to create a comprehensive list of your data sets. So the main point when we're talking about choosing your data set is to bear in mind that whether it is feasible to publish this data, whether it be openly, like on a public website or even more of a private domain, or otherwise. So if you're working with personal data of some sort, so this oftentimes includes something that I'm a little bit more familiar with, which is transcripts oftentimes are very confidential information that you cannot really be publishing publicly out there. So these are considerations you need to keep in mind when doing that. Another additional thing is oftentimes interviews that might have some sort of identifiable information or talk about private things that might be identifiable. So that kind of data is the data that you cannot really publish openly for this. But for example, if you have an anonymous survey or a confidential survey, which we talked about the differences between anonymous and confidential in past classes, where confidential has some sort of identifiable information in some other server somewhere that is not linked to the actual data, but can be not linked directly, but is indirectly able to be linked. Whereas anonymous data is essentially where there's no linked or no identifiable way of getting who the participant is or in any way what it is. So if you have confidential, and I mean truly confidential or anonymous data, that is, in a way open for publishing and having open access to, whereas these interviews and transcripts, something that has names or even birth dates at time, is oftentimes not really able to be published in an open access frame. After you've chosen your data set, kind of a sub-step of that is actually cleaning up the data set. In reality, I don't think that this is so much related to open data as much as it is related to good research practices in general. A lot of people aren't very fond of cleaning up data sets, whereas I am kind of one of those unique individuals that actually loves cleaning data sets. When you think of cleaning data sets like it's an actual puzzle of some sort, where you're going to experience problems and your entire point is to look over and to solve those problems, then data cleaning becomes way more fun. And again, that is not a shared opinion, but that is one of my opinions. Part of cleaning up your data set is making it so that it is able to be utilized by other researchers as well. I don't want a data set that just says variable 1 to variable 1000, right? That's not really an applicable case where I can use that data set. I need actual good names for my variables and so forth. And another thing that is also great is to have an actual data dictionary associated with your variables that you created. Now, I have a picture of SPSS up here. I don't know how familiar everyone is with SPSS, but one nice thing about SPSS is that what it does have is this data view and variable view, in which this variable view is actually just a codebook that SPSS automatically helps to generate. It gives you the name of the variable, what the actual variable means, and the values that are associated with that variable. Something to keep in mind, as beautiful as SPSS does with this to create a codebook for us, is that not everyone has access to SPSS though. So really what your best option is to put it into a utilizable format that is free to everybody. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with SPSS. It's a great statistical software. However, because there's a paywall behind it, we're trying to get away from that within this open data movement so that everyone can have access. Remember our talk about having it so that it doesn't discriminate? Well, I would like to think that if there's a paywall, it's some way discriminating against those without some sort of funding opportunity to access your data. So when we're doing this, you oftentimes want to convert it to some sort of Excel data sheet that will have the variables that are clearly labeled, and additionally a data dictionary to actually focus in so that we can have a better understanding of what is in those variables. So it might be a little unclear now, but what a data dictionary does is it gives you the name of the variable and then a description of what that variable is, and then additionally the actual values that that variable can take. I can't tell you how useful data dictionaries have been to me in my research, not only when I create them for myself, but when other people create a great data dictionary to actually analyze data. There's no guessing games associated with it. I don't need to contact anyone. It's clearly understandable, and it makes it easier for everyone. As obvious as it may sound, oftentimes people aren't very good at this actually. So this is why we really try to, hit your head with these ideas of cleaning up a data set and how important it really is to have a clear, identifiable, easy to read data set that not only has a clear data dictionary associated with it, but also the variables are easy to understand just by reading a variable where I can read something where it says gender and I say that is a variable about gender and I can hopefully trust it. Now we can actually talk about, once you've chosen your data set and hopefully clean the data set as well, about where to actually put the data sets in. Now, we've given you 3 examples here, which is the SciArXiv, even though it has kind of an odd spelling. There's the SOSArXiv and the Center for Open Science. Now, these are all kind of nonprofit organizations that allow you to host your data publicly to individuals. And while you're doing this, hopefully there's a way that you can license the data as well so that you are the sole owner of the data, but you're allowing for it to be publicly available so that they can have make it so that we can have it available for users to use it and not discriminate in a way. So really, like PsycArXiv is dedicated for psych research for it to be open and publicly accessible. SocArXiv is essentially the same thing, but through more of the social sciences, a little bit broader of a category. And then the Center for Open Sciences is something that we've really talked about a lot, where they're just generally open into these open data science movements. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about communicating the data sets. We can actually communicate these out to the world so that you can have your data open for your own publishing purposes or other people to publish as well with your data. If you open up a bunch of data sets, if you open up even just one data set, though, it's worth spending a bit of time to make sure that people know or at least can find your data set. By posting it to those places in the previous slide, you are actually making it so that these are accessible to individuals to search for your data sets. This might require you naming the data set something very findable, something that's unique enough so that it's not kind of in the pool of a lot of other things, but unique enough to make it found. You need to find that balance of what you're going to name it, how you're going to describe the data set, and so forth. In addition, you can announce it via press releases in some form, announcing it to a website, and many, many other ways that you can do it. But it's really important that when you post these data sets, you actually make an effort to let people know that they're available and you want people to use them. And you really need to keep in mind too that when you publicly post these data sets, you're actually give yourself some credibility because you are getting credit for the data set that is done. And assuming you posted it publicly via these kind of open science collaboration sites, you have the correct licensure to have the data, and it is your intellectual property that you are allowing out to the public. So yeah, really the main point is once you post the data set, that's not it. You need to actually communicate the data set, allow individuals to know where the data set is, and that you have it for them to utilize. Next slides, what we're going to be doing is actually talking about some of these search engines to find these public data sets. So these are public data sets that are posted by governments, by nonprofit organizations, healthcare industry maybe, and even privately owned, publicly posted data sets as well. So let's get started on our first one. Our first one is actually through Google Dataset Search. Now I want you to notice that this is still in beta form. This is actually a very new way of looking for data sets. I was actually a big fan when this first came out. I thought it was amazing. Google finally coming into this data set game so that we can get large publicly available data sets available for individuals to utilize. This works just like Google. You type in some keywords for a data set that you're looking for, and this is where I was talking about why it's really important to name your data set something very specific but not too specific in order to be able to be captured in these search engines. Now, keeping in mind that once you post it to those previously posted places, you are on now this Google Dataset Search to find the data sets available. So you can use this as a researcher to search for publicly available data sets or even have your own data available in here as well. And part of your assignment for today is going to be actually finding data sets via these avenues, one being Google Dataset Search, and comparing them and seeing, are people that are posting these public data sets, are they making it easy to read? Are they making it so that it is actually accessible to me? Is it in a format that I am able to access that is free to me as well? And for you to actually write a reflection on your feelings on how well the open science and open data world is actually doing. So now we've concluded with Google Data. We can move on to Another one, which is Socrata. This is just another open data site that we want to focus on, where they give you more options. So you might want to go and expand beyond Google Dataset Search. Think of like an analogous example of like, when you're doing a lit search of some sort, you don't just go to like one journal finder. You go through many different sources. You might use Google Scholar, you might use the CSU University Library, you might use just PsycInfo in order to find articles related to some sort of paper. Well, this isn't too different, right? This is somewhat similar, but now it's just in the search of data sets. So you want to look through different search engine avenues in order to find data sets that you find appropriate. Another one is data.gov. I think this is great. This is where you can get census data. This is where you can get, large public data sets on actual population-based studies that you can make really great inferences. And you can even get this down to like city level, state level, your county level, and country level as well. So and I think that the data.gov does a really good job of making very understandable data sets and so forth. Now, I'll say you might think this is free from like having false data. You would think that we're really good. The U.S. government is very good at making prime data sets. But I'll tell you, there have been situations in the past with even things like census data, which you would think is very well analyzed and very well trusted, where they have found 10 years later a problem with the data set. In which case, they need to go back and have to change everything. So even though you should be trusting these, just keep in mind, these even government organizations are prone to error within their data sets with tons of eyes looking in on them. But they still can experience the same problems of human error that you and I might experience as well. It's a little bit on a larger scale, the problem, because I can't imagine how many studies have been done using U.S. Census data, and that finding out that U.S. Census data has been wrong after you posted and created an article and published an article on it. It seems pretty bizarre to me, but it does happen. Just to give you a little an understanding of how hard this can be at times. NCBI, this is the NIH. This is more like kind of health stuff where they have a lot of different projects going on, a lot of different data sets as well. So if you're kind of more in this kind of health concentrated aspect, like me, I'm in the health psychology. This is a place that you can really go and look up some really interesting data sets as well. Keep in mind, this is .gov, so this is also government data as well. Kaggle is one I'm actually not as familiar with, but it seems like a pretty promising avenue for more data sets as well. I can see from the images that you have things like heart disease that you can look into. So, I mean, even things like FIFA 19 complete player data sets. So if you're interested in soccer, which seems to be a running example in this class, given the example where I asked you to give examples of how an experiment where we can determine if referees make racial calls when they're giving out red cards or not, is something that you can really look into as well. So another great thing about these data set searches is the amount of data and the types of data that you can get are vast. Really interesting things. So this Kaggle seems like it's a little bit more in that vast area where it has a lot of different types of data sets that go beyond that of health and community populations and so on and so on. Now, something also to notice is these open data badges. I know that I have brought these up before, but this is just a list of journals that allow for these badges that kind of inform that a paper was published based off of either open data, which is what the topic of today is, in which we have talked about the data is publicly available for you to run the analysis yourself, or other analysis that you see fit, where you can contact the actual owner of the data, who has the intellectual rights to the open data. Next, another open badge that's often there is whether or not the study was pre-registered. This has been a hot topic in this class, right? Where we've always talked about pre-registering your studies, formulating hypotheses before you actually run the analysis. Otherwise, you're in danger of harking and other cherry picking, harking practices, question trolling, and so forth from not pre-registering your hypothesis. Additionally, there's open materials, which is saying in general the materials that you utilize to perform the study. So these are measures that you may have done, any sort of measures is kind of the main thing that I'm thinking of. It's like, are those publicly available, or are they behind a paywall where I can't really even analyze them by any means? So perceived stress scale is an openly available measure that often has good reliability. Additionally, there is the CESD, which is the Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale, which is publicly available as well. So if you have all open materials, you are allowed to have these open science badges on published papers or that are associated with your data. And really on this slide is just an example of all the different journals now that are allowing for these badges to encourage the use of open data, pre-registered hypotheses, and open materials. Wikidata is another way that you can look into other other data sets as well. Again, I'm not as familiar with this, but this seems like it's really more just catching data associated with Wikipedia articles. This seems more of a data sciencey thing that you would be interested in if you were into data science and catching like large things of text to analyze, which seems to be a little bit more of an advanced practice to me. Now that we've talked about open data and all the applications associated with it and the steps to get from a data set that you privately own to having it actually be an open data set for others to publicly use, what we want to do now is actually have a class activity where originally we were supposed to split into pairs and you were to work together, but now it seems like it's going to be more of an individual process given the current conditions and that we are doing virtual teaching now. If you can work in pairs, I would gladly encourage it. However, what this is going to mean is that you are going to now be posting things to a quiz question in which I want you to give me some of your reflections. So if you go to the module for today's lesson, there will actually be an activity there for you to run through the activity. Now I'll go ahead and explain it here, but there's more information in the actual module section. So for this activity, what we're going to do is I'm going to have you search via a social data set searching site. You can use Google Dataset Search or one of those other ones that we mentioned earlier, where I want you to look for a certain psychological theory, such as like attachment theory, and some maybe cognitive dissonance theory, collectivism, and see what gets pulled up about these data sets. Can you find a set of data sets that are associated with theories in psychological research is what we're kind of hoping for. So what we'd like you to do, go and find your preferred dataset search engine of choice. I'm quite fond of Google Datasets, but data.gov is also a great one as well. It's a little less good for finding psychological theories. I would actually encourage Google Dataset Search for that. And I want you to open up a few data sets that are associated with a theory that you chose. Find one that interests you and compare them and actually give us a reflection of whether you think that these are utilizable data sets to you. Do you think that if you were to get this data set, you could run a research study associated with it? And also, I want you to pull up a few data sets, not just one data set, but a few, in which I want you to note some of the similarity and the differences among the the data sets and really think, could I intermix these data sets if I needed to? What are some of the problems? Are the variables labeled similarly enough so that I can understand things? What difficulties might there be if I'm trying to analyze some sort of outcome from each of these data sets? What can be focused on? Because we would think that if we're looking at a similar theory, we would have similar outcomes that we're looking at as well, and at least similar predictors of some sort. So go ahead and find a database search engine that you have. I have a few links on the actual module page for this quote-unquote quiz question, in which you'll actually do this, and then I want you to write a reflection of what you found and what was most interesting. So to sum up our first virtual lecture of the semester, we have three kind of summing up points here. So to start, open data has a lot of benefits, but it's not limited to transparency in the practice of science, right? Transparency is kind of what people think of as the main thing, but a lot of places have benefited from this. As we saw, Canada saved $3.2 billion due to taxpayer fraud because they opened up their data and allowed citizens to actually research and analyze the data of where their money is going, which is an aspect that is so important to them. Next, there's a lot of databases that exist for sharing data, and I've shared just a few, but there's more that go beyond that. And additionally, there's a lot of search engines that are associated with finding data sets. It's the 21st century, right? We are focused on using search engines and filtering things from the internet to be able to be viable and interesting to us as the user of the data. Lastly, when you are in this process where you want to be part of this open data movement, this open data movement, care must be taken in to show how the data is formatted for sharing. Is really the main thing. So this means that you need to be a responsible researcher, that you need to first choose the data set. Then you need to clean the data set so that it is analyzable to someone that's not you. Imagine yourself coming into this data set fresh and seeing what I understand what this data set is about if I had no idea, had zero understanding of things. This can be done through proper variable naming, as simple as that, or data dictionaries as well. It's a great way for that. And for next lab, which will be on next Tuesday, so we're continuing class as normal now, we have one more reading for you to do. It's Baumeister 1998. I personally haven't read it quite yet, but I will be reading it beforehand and we'll be discussing it, and there will be an assignment with this. So I would make sure you really read the article because we will have an assignment associated with it. And thank you so much.